Good morning. Back by popular demand this morning, it's our annual Eulogies service. This morning we'll be remembering persons of note who died in 2013. These are people outside our congregation who we may never have met, but whose lives have touched ours in some way. And Vance has already begun with some of the musical references this morning. Some are well known, some barely made it onto the public radar. Some changed the course of nations. Some set a record. Some were pioneers. Others may have invented an item so ubiquitous, something you use so often that it is now invisible to you. All were human beings like us, and their legacies remind us of the power of a single life to touch others, and it reminds us of the interconnectedness of all people. Enjoy.
For our musical interlude today, we're going to take some quick looks at some notable musicians who passed away in 2013, and we'll play a snatch of a well-known piece from one of these people, sort of in the manner of Name That Tune game. We'll let you see if you can figure out who it is, and then I'll talk a little bit about the person associated with the music. Tchaikovsky. In 1957, the U.S. was reeling from the first launch of a spacecraft by our arch rival, the Soviet Union. In 1958, the Soviet Union was stunned when a 23-year-old American pianist, Van Cliburn, won the first international Tchaikovsky competition, which was supposed to be another monument to Soviet greatness. He kicked their butts. And he passed away in Fort Worth at February.
M-I-C.
See you real soon.
K-E-Y.
Why? Because we like you.
M-O-U-S-E.
Mouse. Yeah, Annette Funicello. The reason the antics of bad girls like Miley Cyrus and Lindsay Lohan make the news is because they fall so far short of the squeaky clean standard set by the first Disney child star, Annette Funicello. She was known as America's sweetheart, not as jailbait or tabloid cover. She suffered from multiple sclerosis at the end of her life and succumbed to its effects in April. That Bach-like sound was produced by Ray Manzarek. He had classical piano lessons when he was a child, but he really got passionate about playing piano when he heard jazz on the radio. So his blend of classical, jazz, and blues styles brought a new sound and a new level of sophistication to pop music in the 60s with the band The Doors. He died in Germany in May.
Blame it on the bossa nova, the dance of love.
Edie Gourmet had two careers in parallel. She was known as a smooth pop singer in the United States, but in the Spanish-speaking world, she had hit records also that few people in this country knew about. She grew up in New York, speaking Ladino Spanish in her Jewish family. She died in August. Just because I asked a friend about her, just because I spoke her name somewhere. Just because I called her number by mistake today. She thinks I still care. We lost a great of country music, Ray Price, in December. He was a country crooner who had over 100 hits, and this wasn't one of them. The singer of She Thinks I'll Still Care had more hits, 139, than any other country artist ever, including many that we consider classics of the genre. Waylon Jennings once said, "If we could all sound like we wanted to, we'd all sound like George Jones."
And the company jumps when he plays reveille. He's a boogie-woogie bugle boy, company B.
Patty Andrews was the lead singer, the youngest and the last survivors of the Andrews sisters, a close harmony trio that was one of the biggest acts of the 1930s and 40s, but you still hear their influences today. She passed away this year as well. And finally, Shelley Jackson Denham was a folk singer and Unitarian Universalist. She was a folky songwriter, but two of her songs are in our gray hymnal. Credo is number 354, and after the meditation, we will sing number 86, Blessed Spirit of My Life.
Nelson Mandela's birth name was Rolihlahla. This is not a perfect pronunciation of it. It's from the language of his home village. Okay, I took a tutorial, and I'm going to try this. The village's name is Qunu. Qunu. I'm clicking with an American accent. The name of the language I really can't pronounce at all. The anglicized version is pronounced Kasa. It contains several sounds we do not have in English and which I cannot yet make. You never know what's going to happen in life, so I leave room for the possibility. Rolihlahla, shaker of trees. Mandela's birth name means shaker of trees, which is a euphemism for troublemaker. How auspicious. He was born on July 18th, 1918, to a royal family, the Madiba clan of the Tembu people. South Africa had just established its independence from Britain 10 years before, and the all-white government had deemed that no black Africans could hold public office. Although some could vote initially, even the scant political rights they had were revoked within a couple of years. In 1913, the Native Lands Act was passed, limiting black Africans who made up 80% of the population to just 7.3% of the country's land. The land that Mandela's village inhabited was not legally theirs. Rather, because they were black, they were considered tenants, and they had to pay the government rent. Most people in his village did not know how to read or write. The concept of education was foreign to most of the people he knew. When we hear that Mandela's family was royalty, it evokes a certain image in our minds of luxury. In reality, his mother had 3 huts, he says, one for cooking, one for sleeping, and one for storage. They slept on mats and sat on the ground. She planted and harvested her own corn. From the age of 5, Mandela was a herd boy, watching over the cows, and he learned to forage for wild honey and shoot a bird out of the sky with a slingshot. He started in with his troublemaking early on. As young boys, he and his friends slept in the same hut, and they would get in trouble for bedwetting. Mandela was known for his ability to stealthily swap the soiled blankets of his with the dry blankets of another boy's without waking him. The unsuspecting sound sleeper that would then take the fall when they awoke. not nice. But you have to admit, it takes cunning to pull that off. He was artful in the old-fashioned sense of the word, sly, crafty, and calculating. Our image of him now as a quiet and dignified elder masks those personality traits. Reading about his childhood, one gets the impression of a sense of freedom in nature. He played in wide open spaces with other children, swam in creeks, and traveled along footpaths worn through grassy fields because there were no roads. What we call cousins and aunts and uncles were just called brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers in his native language. In contrast, what Mandela encountered outside his village was a world of strict boundaries, barriers, and racism. He did not become political as a young adult right away, however. As a student at the University of Fort Hare, he was best known for being best dressed. In fact, most people who've been interviewed about Mandela mention his style as one of his most outstanding features. He was also known at that time to be vain and egotistical and too much of a ladies' man for his own good. Even imperfect people go on to achieve great things. In fact, that's the only kind of people who ever do. In college, Mandela took courses that would support his leadership later, but his most political act at that time was boycotting the school food. And that was enough to get him kicked out without a degree. Returning home, he learned that he had been committed in marriage against his will. He fled to Johannesburg, where he made friends with members of the African National Congress, a group fighting for equal rights for Black South Africans. And that's where his political journey was launched. As he rose through the ranks of the ANC, Mandela took an African nationalistic perspective. Seeing that outsiders had caused so much harm in his country, he rejected calls to collaborate with other racial minority groups, such as South Africans of Indian heritage. He felt that Africans had to develop their own ways from within. Nevertheless, the nonviolence of Gandhi inspired him, and so he also taught nonviolence at first. Unfortunately, in 1960, when the white government perpetrated a brutal massacre on Black Africans, killing even babies in their mother's arms, Mandela began to feel that the cost of nonviolence was too high. In a televised interview, he declared that it was time to reconsider. It caused great debate within the ANC, but Mandela prevailed. He began formal study of war, reading Che Guevara and other writers, and studying the history of his own country with an eye for uprising. He founded a guerrilla army, of which he was the chief commander. Eventually, the authorities caught up with Mandela, and he was arrested. At his trial, he delivered not a defense, but a manifesto, in which he wrote, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." He was sentenced to life in prison. He spent 18 of his 27 years of incarceration in a hard labor camp, sleeping in a cell so tiny it has been described by witnesses as hardly inhabitable. He slept on the floor and had only a bucket for a bathroom. During the day, he did forced labor in a rock quarry. He was allowed only one 30-minute visit per year from his wife. Unbelievably, it was during this time of intense psychological and physical cruelty that the brilliant but notoriously egotistical, self-promoting, and crafty Mandela transformed himself into the dignified diplomatic leader and teacher of forgiveness the world recognizes today. In prison, he learned to exert a different kind of power. He forged relationships with other prisoners, becoming their leader behind bars, and he organized them in behaving in such a way as to make the guards treat them with more dignity. Over the years, he won improvements in prison conditions and developed the friendship of one guard to the point that the man helped sneak Mandela's newborn grandson into the prison so Mandela could see him. When an international movement and South African politics finally led to his release in 1990, the Mandela who emerged was frail compared to the outsized man who had been locked up. He had become an elder, soft-spoken, still striking in his appearance, but with a new opportunity to heal and unite his country. In 1991, all apartheid laws were finally banished, and in 1994, Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first democratically elected president. He established a broadly interracial cabinet and founded the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate crimes committed by the apartheid government and by his own African National Congress. As Mandela wished, he served only one term, retiring from office at the age of 80. By the end of his life, he had received more than 250 awards, including the Nobel Peace Prize and the US Presidential Medal of Freedom. He died a little more than a month ago at the age of 95. Although his methods changed over the course of his lifetime, and despite spending over a quarter of his life behind bars, Mandela never wavered in his devotion to democracy, equality, and learning. Now freed from an aged and ailing body, he lives on in the lives of all who are touched by his legacy.
I am grateful for the opportunity to serve this congregation. I'm grateful for the chance to give a part of myself that isn't needed anywhere but here. I have read that some people feel so strongly about their faith and their religious community that they plead for the privilege of sharing their resources with others. Giving is a blessing, not a burden. Let it be that way for you too. The offering baskets are going to come around. Give some money and give a blessing.
We're going to play a song by Hugh Masekela, a South African musician who was purged from the country, sent into exile rather than being put in prison. It's called Bring Him Back Home. Bring him back home, Nelson Mandela. Bring him back home to Soweto. I want to see him walking down the street of South Africa. Tomorrow, bring back Nelson Mandela. Bring him back home to Soweto. I want to see him walking down the street of South Africa. No more sorrow. Bring back Nelson Mandela. Bring him back home to Soweto. I want to see him walking down the streets of South Africa. No more sorrow. Bring back Nelson Mandela. Bring him back home to Soweto. I want to see him walking down the streets of South Africa tomorrow. Bring back Nelson Mandela. Bring him back home to Soweto. I want to see him walking down the streets of South Africa. tomorrow. Live on, Nelson Mandela. Live on in hearts all around the world. All the people walking hand in hand, walking for peace now. Hallelujah. Mandela. On behalf of the congregation and Circles New Mexico, the charity that receives our Change for the Future, I thank you for your generosity. Take a minute to turn to the people sitting next to you and greet them with the peace of the day. We've chosen a few other notable people to focus on. I'd like to tell you about Dr. Douglas Engelbart, a name you probably have never heard, but whose work you touch and see every day. In 1968, very few people had even seen a computer, much less touched one. Those who interacted with them fed them punched cards or used big cast aluminum terminals with little fuzzy green letters on black backgrounds. In 1968, Doug Engelbart, who was a researcher at Stanford, unveiled the modern world to the public. In a presentation to a computing conference, he stunned his colleagues by showing them for the first time what we today consider the normal interface for a personal computer. He demonstrated multiple windows, hypertext, that is links you can click on that take you to other information, graphics, video conferencing. He invented the mouse. His handmade mouse was out of wood and machined aluminum. He showed word processing and a collaborative real-time editor, something Google Docs has only recently come up with again. Before the demonstration, a lot of computer scientists thought Doug Engelbart was a crackpot. But his demonstration is now called the mother of all demos. It's recognized as one of the most important events in the history of computing. His vision of computing was the basis for the look and feel of every computer we use today. So the next time you take out your smartphone or your netbook, thank Doug Engelbart that you don't have to have a green screen terminal to use it.
Sterling A. Colgate was an American physicist and a visionary. He was born in New York in 1925 into the Colgate family. Yes, those Colgates, and died on December 1st this past year. Sterling was an exciting, passionate man interested in just about everything. His discoveries and inventions run the gamut from nuclear explosions and supernovas to HIV prevention and nearsightedness. Rubbing shoulders with the world's best physicists began early. As a teenager, Sterling was sent out west to the Los Alamos Ranch School. In 1942, the boys at the school got a visit from Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones. Sterling recognized Smith and Jones. They were actually J. Robert Oppenheimer and Ernest O. Lawrence. The school closed that year and became the living quarters for the Manhattan Project. Continuing his Los Alamos connection, Colgate finished a PhD in nuclear physics at Cornell under Robert R. Wilson, the former leader of the cyclotron group in the Manhattan Project and future director of Fermilab. At only 29, Colgate found himself in charge of all diagnostics for America's first hydrogen bomb test, codenamed Castle Bravo. Sterling thought that those predicting the bomb yield had missed an additional nuclear reaction path. He expected that the explosion was going to be much more powerful than planned for. And he told the general in charge to put several more tons of coral, because that was what they had available, on top of the bunker, on top of the measurement bunker built under Bikini Atoll. Sterling was right. The Bravo test yielded 15 megatons rather than the planned for 5. The extra coral that Sterling had ordered was all blown away, but the data and Sterling survived. Lest you think Colgate's life was all about bombs, it's important to know that he was not a hawk and that he was a lifelong inspiration for students. One of the best things he ever did was serving as New Mexico Tech's president from 1965 to 1974. He had Tech students working on projects with him for the rest of his life. He led far-out research. One professor at Tech wanted to know what the electric field and pressure were like inside a tornado. So Sterling volunteered to fire sounding rockets into tornadoes from his private plane. The student in his plane had to figure out when to fire the rocket while the plane bucked like a wild horse in the surrounding winds. Sterling Colgate walked around campus in cutoffs and an Indiana Jones-type hat, like that. He was friendly, informal, and definitely in the students' corner. Sterling diffused Vietnam protests by holding forums in which he'd sit down and talk with the entire campus. He prevented Socorro police from coming on campus to bust students for marijuana. And he rescued one student, at least one student, from a Mexican jail. The stories go on, some wildly crazy and many full of kindness. Colgate empowered students and he encouraged their dreams. One 60s-era student he empowered was Candy Lindquist, your Director of Religious Education. Candy was friends with Sterling and his wife Rosie for 43 years, and she gives Sterling full marks for her realization that the most important part of teaching is getting kids excited about learning. After meeting Rosie and Sterling through Candy in the 1980s, I got to know him better when I joined the New Mexico Tech faculty in 2002. I know that Sterling leaves an astonishing legacy of accomplishment, including bringing the Very Large Array radio telescope to New Mexico. In the final decade of his life, flying his plane weekly between Tech and Los Alamos, Sterling worked on a rapidly rotating 55-gallon drum filled with hot liquid sodium, a scale model of the plasma that fills the space between galaxies. So far as I know, it's the only physics experiment that has a manual 5-on-the-floor transmission. I helped Sterling write the National Science Foundation funding proposal for the dynamo, but it was criticized as being too ambitious for the available resources. Well, almost everything Sterling tried in his life was too ambitious for the available resources, but he was usually right. In the months before he died, his sodium dynamo project proved a theory of galaxy formation for which a similar project at Princeton had failed. It's been said before, but this time it's true. Sterling was larger than life. He was an extraordinary person and left the world richer for his presence. As Rosie, his wife of 66 years, said at his memorial gathering, he wasn't perfect, but he was wonderful.
Frank Titus was a renowned New Mexican geologist and water conservationist who died last December. Until the mid-1990s, city leaders believed that Albuquerque was different from other desert cities because it sat over a huge aquifer, larger than Lake Superior, a magazine ad promoting the city claimed in 1984. If only. Frank Titus spoke prophetically about the precarious state of our water resources. Here are his words. As population pressures increase on the fixed water resources, if we are to avoid a chaos of increasing litigation, legislative power politics, and politically based piecemeal decisions, we must develop regional planning and cooperation and substitute these for the present competition and divisiveness over water. To opt for a no-action alternative is to opt for agricultural water rights to be bought out faster, for the water crisis to arrive sooner, and for social and economic consequences to be more bewildering. There is no source of water available to us outside of the supply we have now, so we've got to learn to live with what we've got. A hard message to hear, and harder still to live into. When he died, Titus was at work on a 21st century update to the water budget he developed for Albuquerque in the 1990s. Bruce Thompson, former head of the University of New Mexico Water Resources Program, called Titus the conscience of the water community. His conscience has changed the way this city thinks about water, a resource upon which all life depends. And for all this, we can be forever grateful.
It is impossible to name everyone of importance or even of interest who died during a year in a service like this, but here's a quick and maybe quirky overview. George Mitchell owned the oil company that developed the technique of hydraulic fracking and got this process exempted from Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, starting a boom in U.S. energy production. A second-generation Greek-American embodiment of the American dream, he and his wife were major philanthropists who contributed heavily to projects and research in environmentalism and sustainable development. In 1947, Mikhail Kalashnikov, an engineer in the Soviet Army, developed a submachine gun so diabolically durable and useful that it comprises today, more than 50 years later, one of 10 of all guns in the world, the AK-47. Kalashnikov once said that he was proud of his invention, but sad that it was used by terrorists, and that he had always wanted to engineer agricultural machinery. Something here about swords and plowshares. Anyway, he died last year. Richard Griffiths, the actor who played Harry Potter's abusive Uncle Vernon, died last year at the age of 65. In real life, he was much kinder than the awful character he played, and Daniel Radcliffe, who played Harry Potter, remembers him fondly. Griffiths was born to deaf parents, and he thought that that accounted for his talent in nonverbal expression. He died of heart disease. Paul Walker of the Fast and Furious movie series died in a high-speed car wreck. Corey Monteith of the TV program Glee died at age 31 of a drug overdose. Pauline Phillips, aka Dear Abby, Joyce Brothers, and Virginia Johnson of Masters and Johnson's fame all died this year. Strong women with a no-nonsense approach to delicate subjects. They taught us about our relationships, our bodies, ourselves. Best-selling author, sociologist, and Catholic priest Andrew Greeley died last year, still a priest in good standing, in spite of his scathing criticism of the nation's Roman Catholic bishops, whom he once described as, quote, morally, intellectually, and religiously bankrupt. If the church wanted to salvage American Catholicism, he continued, it would be well advised to retire a considerable number of mitered bird brains. The inventors of the Etch-a-Sketch, the bank credit card system, chemotherapy, and digital dialing, as well as the makeup effects wizard who created Yoda, all died last year. Also Ray Dolby of Dolby Stereo Sound, the inventor of the party game Twister, and the co-founder of Target Stores. Our world would be a different place if they had not lived and contributed as they did. T.J. Jemison, a National Baptist pastor in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, led what has been called the first civil rights bus boycott in 1953. He had persuaded the Baton Rouge City Council to abolish a law which reserved the first 10 rows of seats on buses for whites, even if they were empty and all the back rows were filled. The bus drivers then went on strike to protest, and Jameson went into action. We weren't necessarily interested in ending segregation, he said. We just wanted our seats on the bus. He later advised Martin Luther King Jr. on how to organize the Montgomery bus boycott. He died last year at the age of 95. Talia Castillo battled cancer for 7 of her 13 years. She was also a YouTube star with her perky middle school makeup videos, which she started and continued while on chemo. "Makeup is my wig" was one of her slogans. She was featured on CoverGirl magazine last year, which must have been quite a thrill. She died in July. Doris Lessing, one of our era's mothers of feminism, died this year, along with some of the women pioneers in a man's world. Yvonne Brill, a rare female rocket scientist who invented a key part of the rocket propulsion systems, which are still used today, died at the age of 88. Helen Thomas of the White House Press Corps died this year, as did Margaret Thatcher, who, aside from her well-known political accomplishments in the UK, also invented a crucial part of the process that enabled the development of soft-serve ice cream. Finally, Ruth Benarito, USDA chemist who helped perfect permapress, died this year. So if you didn't get up half an hour early to iron your shirt or blouse this morning, you owe Ruth a big debt of gratitude. I close with a quote from movie critic Roger Ebert, who died this year at the age of 70 after an 11-year stint of living with cancer. He wrote this: "Kindness covers all my political beliefs. No need to spell it out. I believe that if at the end, according to our abilities, we've done something to make others a little happier and something to make ourselves a little happier, that's about the best we can do. To make others less happy is a crime. To make ourselves unhappy is where all crime starts. We must try to contribute joy to the world. That's true no matter what our problems, our health, our circumstances. We must try. I didn't always know this, and I'm happy I lived long enough to find it out."